Welcome to another episode of Feed the Trolls. I have got Messioso with us, the general manager of Complexity's Counter-Strike team, and Thorin, of course, is here. And today we are talking about the big news that shocked all the trolls a couple of weeks ago when it was announced that there would no longer be open qualifiers for some of the RMRs for the Shanghai Major, which is coming up at the end of the year. We're going to break that down and have a look at it. I always do love controversy around the major and specifically formats because we always complain about the format we have and say it'll be better if it changes. And then when it changes, we complain about the change. So that's where we're at. Let's see how much we can complain. But before we start, I want to talk a little bit about how qualifiers for the major have run in the past, because there's probably a lot of people watching who, and I've seen this, when they'll tune in for the major and they just go, where's Astralis? That's their main question. They have absolutely no idea how teams have got there. So Messioso, let's get into it. Before, how it works with the open qualifiers. I mean, you can walk us through this. You know this whole format. What did it used to look like?
Yeah, I mean, it's changed a lot over the course of history, but I think the most recent one is just open qualifiers, anywhere between 2 and 4, I think, for most regions, leading into closed qualifiers where some teams were the best teams in the regions were invited, and then those teams played in the closed qualifier. They qualified to the RMR, which then went offline. So that was played on LAN events. And then, so anywhere between 2 and 16 or 17 teams from those, depending on the region, qualified to the major. It was pretty simple. You know, anyone could create 5 players and just qualify for the major if they wanted to.
And that was the magic, right, Thorin? Was that there was this dream that you could just get, you and your band of brothers, and off you went to the major, but not quite. There were some problems with this format that a lot of people had and that we saw, obviously, as we went through different majors.
Even though you say it like comedically, I actually do think, even though I can't confirm this because like no one can really talk to Vov about these things, you can maybe have like half a conversation over a beer at a major, best case scenario. And even then you're not really getting the guy who designs the rule book and why he did it, So I have to speculate what Valve's like mind state was. But I would say if you look at the way they have messaged throughout their time in Counter-Strike, they have quite clearly, with some of the things they've done, like take away the coach being able to talk all the time, they have quite clearly flexed the idea that their tournaments and Counter-Strike professional play should actually be, in theory, what you're saying. The joke is if the 3 of us and 2 other people were good enough today, even with no pro team, if we could enter the tournament and qualify through, that is actually what I think Valve wants esports to be. I think they have a very, I would say, antiquated idea where, to me, they do sort of act like it's 2002 and, how can we know if this league is real and the results are like, they do that sort of thing where we all have to pretend. Like, I always give this analogy. They actually, I think, must be the biggest fans ever of that movie from the 80s called The Wizard, which was a movie, which people don't know, was actually a marketing tool for Super Mario Brothers 3, I think it was, or 2 or whatever. And in the movie, they just have this like global Nintendo competition, and every person, including some kid who in this movie is like literally living in like a trailer park in nowhere in America, every kid just goes and plays and the joke is like this guy's little brother wins like the world championship of Super Mario. I've actually always felt that is what Valve think their game is. I think they really do believe, sadly, that like we should be allowed to play in it, and if we just happen to be better than Astralis, like you said, we get to go to the major. But my problem with that is it's a beautiful utopian idea, and that's like a concept, like as you say, for a movie, would be a great idea. The problem is we know that just means you're going to end up running loads of qualifiers where 99% of the teams who enter never would have ever made it. And the saddest tragedy of all is, even if they did meet Astralis and beat them in the bracket of the qualifier, they just lose in the next round themselves to like anyone, Gamer Legion, pick any team that you know. So unfortunately, I do think that's actually a good place to start the conversation, because I think a lot of these ideas, I think Riot does it the same way in League of Legends. In League of Legends, they insisted for many years, we pretend as though like North America, in theory, is identically as good as Korea. And it's like, it doesn't matter, like your eyes were telling you Korea was made better. You had to pretend that one day there might come 4 teams from North America that was so straight fire, you had to have them be in the World Championship. So I do think that's a good place to start, because I think actually the principle I don't disagree with. I do like the idea. Like, I would love to believe the romance that there could actually be like a donk type character, or the better one would be maybe someone that like actually is really good, but like pros didn't rate him or something and they were kicked out of the scene. But it's cool, the idea they could put together a team and scout people and make it through. The problem is, I just think like I don't really think it's actually like a practical concept. I don't think that's actually going to happen. And I also think the naive thing from Valve is I don't think they realize how built up the actual Counter-Strike esports scene is. Like, if anything, haven't we all spent the last few years getting amazing at scouting all the talent? Like, the joke now of European Counter-Strike, for example, is all the teams are international. Like, if you literally exist in any country where you can speak English, you could get picked up. It's just look at the flags on some of the players in the HLTV top 20 now. It's wild. So my only issue is, like, in principle, I don't mind it. Like, for example, my compromise to what they do is I'd have something like one open qualifier slot, you know, and then this dream really is there for the lottery aspect, as it were. But I do. Here's what's actually a bit controversial when we get into this. Why I was interested with where messioso would go, because obviously he's in a team and he might like the old system. Is I actually don't mind some of these changes. It's kind of, I'm a bit of an elite, I'm just an open elitist, so I actually like the idea that, like, the system they're doing now is what I always wanted. I might have qualms about how Blaster ESL runs their tournaments, but I do think they do a way better job than just an open qualifier, just letting the chips fall where they may. So I actually like the idea in this system that essentially the circuit outside of the majors is going to heavily inform how these qualifiers work and getting into them, etc. So essentially, the reason why I'll just flip it quickly from an angle as to why people might wonder, like, what's good about being an elitist, is the downside is this, which is in the system we had when we got rid of the Legends system, where the old major used to see if you qualified to this one. And then the one we had for the last few years, he just described. Well, the irony of the one that they had there that a lot of people didn't understand is we're just lucky that these teams are so amazing online and in RMRs, because literally the number one team in the world could absolutely have failed to qualify to the major. It never happened, luckily. We got very, very lucky. But it literally could have happened. You could have had, like essentially all we needed was for FaZe or Vitality or someone to go to that RMR. By the way, God forbid someone's hand get broken, you know, someone get ill. That couldn't really have happened. Luckily, it never did. But that's what I was more worried about. That. So essentially, if you put it all together, I'm sorry if you are some romantic dreamer who believes you are as good as the pros. I'm sorry, I would absolutely sacrifice you getting a chance to definitely not make it through the qualifier for, like, you know, fucking Mouse now to get there. I'd rather Mouse was just guaranteed to get to the RMR, you know.
Let's look at the old format. Obviously, it's now called the old one because of the change. But messioso, what was your feelings on the old format? Literally the one we just used for the major.
I mean, I think it was fine. I don't think there was too many issues with it. I think the biggest issue with it was the amount of time it took for me.
Yes, took ages,
you know,
yeah.
And I think for European teams, maybe not as impactful, but for like teams like us, for example, like if we somehow ended up in an open qualifier for the RMR, I think we did once actually after Rio, maybe. I think the first one of 2023, we might have ended up in the open qualifiers. Okay. Like having to adapt our schedule to be in North America for that, which typically is around the start of the middle of the season. It's always around like the Blast group stage or IEM Cologne or IEM Katowice. Like for us, that's very impactful to not be able to be in the right place at the right time. So, you know, that's like, first world problem, but it does affect teams who need to be in Europe a lot more than other teams, you know, European teams, for example. But, you know, also like sometimes they take up to like 2.5 weeks to play out all the qualifiers. And then if that's time where you can't have proper competition, it's time out of the schedule. So I think that removing the open qualifiers does alleviate some of that issue. And we have heard the rumors that they're planning to potentially move the RMRs themselves as well. So this is sort of a potential step up towards that. Although I think it's still too early to do that. Multiple reasons why. But yeah, there's definitely, I think you can see the intent. The one thing that I think is interesting about what they've done, and it comes back to that whole, like, you know, create a team.
Are you actually a fan of it, by the way? Are you against it? I wondered where you'd be at on it. Because I feel like actually the community sentiment, people say they hate it, I think. So I'm actually kind of surprised not many people on my side.
I'm a big fan of it myself.
Okay.
I have some qualms with it still. I think the European side is fine. No issues with the European side. I think it works great. You know, like, I mean, I'm gonna give an example here. Like, I don't care if Smooya's shitmix version 3 doesn't get a chance to qualify for the major. Like, I think that if you are a team of 5 guys who wants to play in Counter-Strike, you're going to play in Counter-Strike anyway. So, you know, you're going to work your way through the CCTs. And if you get into the top 48, which is the number we're guessing right now is the right amount, then you'll go to the closed qualifier. And that's great. And you've earned it. Yes. But you have to play those first 2 or 3 months to get to the major first. Like, you should, I don't think it's reasonable to expect that a team can just form on the day of the open qualifiers, make their way to the major. I think that's a little bit too Cinderella story for me.
Yes.
Like, I think you have to contribute into the ecosystem to get something out of the ecosystem, and the majors should be the pinnacle of competition. Therefore, it shouldn't just be something you can just get into day one.
Yes.
So,
by the way, two things he says there that I think are really key, though, is one, on the first point, it's not like we're saying Smooth as Shipmix can't play Pro Counter-Strike at the major. They just have to go through the normal circuit. His point, I think, is a very apt one. That's why I say Valve was treating it almost like some crazy, like, romantic, like, coming out of nowhere movie, because like at the end of the day, if the team's actually good enough to get qualified to like I Am Dallas, then get a spot to Cologne, and then they will be at the major. So essentially what you're asking for, if you don't want that, is you do just want fluke one-offs to just come out of nowhere, come to one major and disappear. Then the other thing is, on the other side, what was the second point you said? What was the end thing you were saying there?
It's just about the principle of the fact that you shouldn't just be able to qualify.
Yes,
like, from
that's
nothing straight
also,
to the major.
even
like,
though
there's
people aren't
steps
going to
to
like
take
this,
first.
yeah. Even though people won't like this take, I also do think that's in the modern day a very practical concern we have to have, which is it costs millions of dollars to run professional Counter-Strike teams, right? Even though you might like the idea that like some raw talent could make it through, why should they get an equal chance to qualify over the team that has to spend like $2.5 million to try and get their major slot? Like, I'm not being mean. I think that is a bit unfair. I think we've already got a circuit for them. They can go to ESL Challenger. They can go to like Blast Showdown. There's a million tournaments they can play. And by the way, they can eventually get their own org and get their money. And I feel like that's the weirdest thing. People are taking this idea that it's closed as though we're saying like, right, everyone in now, you're all in CS. Everyone else, fuck you. You don't get to be part. It's like, no, you could. There's a circuit you can come through. You just can't, like he says, go from level 1 to the top level of the game.
100%.
Yeah,
so we're going to rewind
I think there's some
quickly.
issues.
Go on.
I'm gonna rewind
Yeah, go for it.
Go on. Do you have a last point to make or something? Did I cut you off
Yeah,
on the end
let's
of the
jump
point?
back
Or something?
there.
Yeah, go on.
Yeah, there's one little point I
Go
make
on.
is I think the timing that Valve used is really shitty. For example,
Right.
like if you're Cloud9 and you're in the middle of a rebuild and you think,
Oh,
there's
sure.
going to be open qualifiers
Yes.
in 2
Yeah.
months'
Sure.
time that we can play, that's fine. But now they're completely out of the world rankings. They have no opportunity to actually qualify for the next major. They're just fucked. And that like the timing of the announcement is
Right. That's a
more
fair
concerning
point.
for me
Yes.
in that regard than it is for the like, you know, any team now that wants to qualify for the next major, if you didn't exist already 2 weeks ago, you're probably not going to, like, you know, going straight into the summer break. There's no tournaments to play. The first tournaments out of the break are blast groups, which, you know, only 12 teams get to play.
Yep.
Oh, no, I think we're 16 now, aren't we? Yeah, 16. So, like, there's no opportunities for these teams to actually qualify for the major now. Like, if you aren't already a team and you haven't existed for a month at least and won some events, you actually can't qualify for the major. I think that sucks. I think this should have been like a 6 month. This should have been for like the first major of next year kind of change.
Right.
Announce it now.
Fair
Change it for next time. So that sucks. But other than that, yeah, Europe, no problem at all.
I was going to say, I think it's like only really Cloud9 when you think of the big names that might affect. But if we just rewind back, because we jumped straight into it,
Yeah,
there
go
has
for it.
been quite a few changes. But the big change is obviously that for the North America, South America regions and Europe, there are no longer any open qualifiers. And I think what you both touched on is kind of something I want to bring up is someone who's watched Counter-Strike from a developing region, the ugly truth is if you did form a lineup tomorrow, there is no way in hell you are ever going to beat one of the top teams. You will have to grind for the next 3-4 years. We've seen it with every team that's had to move over to Europe or North America to compete. So is it beautiful that you and your friends could set up a team and win the major? Sure. Is it likely? Absolutely not. So it kind of, I'm not quite sure why there was so much backlash to this. And I'm still trying to understand it.
Do you want me to
And I'm-
speculate? Because I've got a really cynical reason for you.
There's-
I actually
why
think
is
low
everyone-
key. Here's the sad thing. I genuinely think, I know this will sound mad, but I think that a lot of people who are commenting on this, who are just in the general public, like, even though they're not even going to try to enter, they just want it to be that if they thought they were really sick, then they could. I think that might even be it. I know it sounds mad, but it's indulgent, but I believe some people might think that on like an unconscious level, you know.
I was so confused because also it doesn't affect, like, there was a lot of conversation around like how smaller teams are screwed now, but I was like, it doesn't
Sure.
affect any other it's the South America, North America and Europe. Like
Yes.
there is those are like they're developed scenes, right? I mean, we can talk about NA struggling a little bit in places, but for the most part, there is no one there. It's not like they're punishing the Mongols. Like everyone will be fine for want of a better term. So I was just super curious about that, and I think that my understanding is kind of where Graham's sitting is that most teams are excited about it. It means less playtime because the schedule is so insane already for these top teams. Now you got to throw in 2 weeks of playing like Pete's pancake whatever to try and get through it. So I think that it's probably welcomed by the pros, right? Which is actually who should be paying attention and putting insight in. But obviously the other side is that now closed qualifiers, like you mentioned, are completely determined by your sort of rankings and where you sit. Does that become a problem down the line? Are we concerned about how that could be abused? Is it going to be abused at some point?
The main problem, surely, on that one is, like, obviously, in a way, we had a trial for this, didn't we? Because we had the ESL rankings that determined if you get into the ESL tournaments. And obviously, the main flaw is just then how accurately or how well done are the rankings. Like, the problem we've had is when the ESL rankings first launched and when Valve's own rankings first launched, they were incredibly scoffed on the outset. Like, they were a million miles from the HLTV one. There was a lot of weird things. In fact, what you're alluding to there is not a minor point. I would say, actually, if you ever go and look, people could have very cynically exploited those. Like, I think it was famously the ESL one was even based on just like players or something, if you remember Messioso. So I think there was one time where I think Lopez ran the numbers once. And if like at some point in time when like Guardian had been kicked out of FaZe, it's like you could have made a team of like players who weren't active and it would have like immediately been like, you know, top 20 in the world, even though it wasn't a team and it wasn't planning to play any matches. So that seems a bit absurd. But the thing is, in general, luckily, I will say, over time, maybe it's because in our game, actually, you get a lot of feedback. People complain openly and publicly. I feel like rankings get better and better and better over time, though, including even the aforementioned ESL one. So as long as Valve like pay attention to the right people, I think they'll get it right eventually. So I'm not too worried about that aspect. I'm not too worried, you know, they're going to accidentally rank someone like 23rd who's actually like 11th best in the world. I think it'll probably get to a similar scenario as HLTV, where even if you disagree by like 2 or 3 spots, like a reasonable amount, you know. So actually, for this sort of a purpose, I think as long as that's just be top 48, so probably work out. I doubt there's many teams will really get screwed or anything, in my opinion.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I just looked at the rankings now. Like, if they took a snapshot now, like the lowest ranked team that would get invited would be the old Guild Eagles team. They don't exist anymore, as far as I know. But like that would be where the cutoff is right now. And like looking at the teams above it, it's like Incilio, Paravision, Eklot, Sinners, Johnny Speeds, Koi, Passions, Ex-Prisi. Like, if you're below those teams, you probably don't deserve to be in the major qualifier anyway.
So likely going to get through the major anyway at that point.
Yeah, exactly. So I look at that and I'm like, actually, this is fine. So yeah, I don't think there's any issues with Europe as much. I think the only issue I still have remaining about what they've done is in the Americas region, because they still haven't. I say they still haven't as if they're going to do it, but they have a big problem with the Americas region, and this also heavily impacts the Asian region, but not as much because they still got open qualifiers for all the different individual regions. Is that the North America and South America are not equal, and especially in Valve's ranking, they are extremely not equal because they don't actually compete domestically against each other. So, like, for example, they've
but it's
announced
called
that,
the
like,
Americas.
Right?
It's called the Americas.
It's called the Americas
Right.
region, and there's two sub-regions.
Yes.
And they've said like they will invite 8 teams to the RMR for the Americas region, but that doesn't differentiate between the North American and South American region.
Right.
And right now, the Valve ranking is heavily based on things like prize money, for example.
Oh, I see where you're going. Yes.
They've had like 4 RES 50K events. They've had that Get Rio event that
like
was
LAN recently,
200K. They've also got Fire League coming up next week, which is heavily South American teams based. So they've got like $600,000 of prize pool into their region, and North America's had like 7,000 or like 25,000. So there's a very big disparity between the two regions, but then they're held to the same standards. So yeah, rightly so. The region right now is dominated by South American teams. So if they invite purely off that ranking, like right now, Liquid and us are fine. We're okay. I think M80 are the 8th team, so they're just about sneaking in. But like the disparity between those two regions right now is a big problem for both the Valve invites.
Put it this way, if you're the 4th best NA team, you're in a tough spot. That I'm guessing, like, compared to Brazilians.
Exactly.
Right?
Yeah.
Right.
So my only caveat with liking the new system is that they need to recognize that North America and South America cannot compete domestically and therefore are not the same region. Whereas Europe and CIS can be merged together.
Sure.
And Asia has to be separated from Oceania. That's fine. But North America has to be separated from South America, for now, at least.
This was my biggest thing, though, about how the system can be abused. I know, like, so looking into the future, I know there's talk about doing away with the RMRs completely, but say that they followed the system and it continued. Like, there is a lot of money in Brazilian Counter-Strike. So you could create a system where you could force most of those slots to be Brazilian teams just by throwing a bunch of money at tournaments and making sure that they're on the rankings. And you could do the same in Europe, to be honest, if you wanted to. Yeah, and it could be even worse, though. Like, even in Europe, you could create a bunch of tournaments next year, massive prize money, and make sure they're invitationals only. Like, I mean, there's been the conversation around conflicts of interest with BetBoom in their first tournaments. I mean, you could set this up that you could ensure that your team gets through to the qualifier. So is there a way to, I mean, what would your solution be to the current problem that you're now seeing this year? So, like, well, how would you fix it? Can you fix it?
I had a conversation with Valve, quite a long conversation at Valve, along with some other with Valve in Copenhagen. And one of the things I recall them saying is that going into next year, they would have ranked and unranked events. And to be ranked, you both have to invite from the ranking, and then you contribute to the ranking. So there will be a certain element of restrictions in what you can and can't do, what conflicts of interest you can and can't have when going into those events. So I'm not too worried about it going into next year, but there is obviously the gray area of coming off this year, which is still the partner leagues, and then also into the start of next year, because the ranking lasts 6 months, you'll still have the lingering effects of the partner leagues going into the first sort of area of next year, which is why I say, like, I hope they don't remove the RMRs for the first event of next year, because it will still have the lingering effects. And I think maybe they'll go onto it in maybe the second event or beyond. I think they also need to see how their ranking is, working out before they make such a drastic change. I think this is like a good middle ground, but I think if they go any further with the current ranking, I think it's a bit of a concern, because I think there's a number of issues, the regionality aspect, both with Americas in North America, South America, but also the whole Asian region, like, because they just cannot play domestically, you can't rank them against each other. And when all the tournament organizers have to use the same ranking to invite from that team, if you just say Asia, well, you're probably going to get the Mongols 100% of the time, because they can't compete domestically. They're never going to give their ELO up to FlyQuest in a domestic matchup. So there's a number of issues, but it's a good first step, and we just need to keep iterating and iterating until we find the sweet spot. But hopefully we just don't make too many drastic changes before that happens.
It actually ties in. I think actually one of the most apt things you said was the big mistake here is just introducing it now in the middle of the season. Like, this would be the perfect thing to announce the day after the Shanghai Major, because it would only affect next year, and we'd get rid of the partner system. Because I agree with you. Like, if you go and look at the teams, for example, that are in Blast, it just means if you're a team like Gamer Legion, who isn't that good a team right now, they're sort of like an all right team, they now have a way better chance of qualifying to these tournaments just because they're in Blast. Like, just by being in Blast group stages, you already had an extra chance, like an extra lottery ticket to get some more points. Whereas a team that might actually be better in the rankings but doesn't have a Blast partner spot, they're just slightly disadvantaged. So I agree, it's just sort of it's almost a weird conflict to even have there. It's unnecessary. You just do it after the next major.
It's a bit
Especially
strange
the way
that
the
Valve
ranking system works. Oh, sorry.
I was just to say, it's a bit strange that Valve was like, we're doing away with the partner system because we want it to be more fair, but also just before we do away with it, we're going to use it to set this up, and now it's not going to be fair.
Yeah. The way the ELO system works as well, especially if you're one of the lower ranked teams in the partner leagues, for example, a Gamer Legion, I'll use that example, but we could also use Complexity sometimes as well. Because it's an ELO system, you typically have very little to lose when you play against a FaZe or Vitality, but if you win, you have a lot to gain. Yeah. So if you get like 1 or 2 upset wins, or Spirit turn up with their coach and without Donk because of the visa issues, you can get a huge win over a highly ranked team. Yes. And as long as they have three of their members, they count as their full roster. So, like, if you played Spirit with Hallie and
in the Blast group stage at the beginning of the year, where they didn't have Donk, right? Yeah. I see.
For example, when like Liquid beat them, I mean, they weren't as highly ranked, obviously, because Katowice came after that. But that's the premise. So if you beat a team like that, and because you're so low ranked, you can get like 30, 35 points, which can move you up like 10, 15 ranks sometimes. Right. So like there's definitely a lot of issues. And like you say, like, the partner leagues, typically have pretty high ranked teams, or the majority of the high ranked teams. It's not like they're completely unearned in that sense, but there's definitely some benefits of being a low ranked team in some of these events, because you score 1 upset win and you can really
poor EG, that 1 win over Heroic, you've done so much.
Exactly. But that's a great example. Because if you win 1 game, you win 30 points. You lose a game, you lose like 3 points. It's like, great, I won 27 points. Fantastic. You come out, you're feeling quite good about yourself. So yeah. Definitely benefits.
What happens? I mean, so they've only done it for these 3 areas, but now what happens if they just get rid of open qualifiers completely? Can they do that? When you take a look at like Middle East, Asia, how spread out those various regions are, how difficult it is for them to play. I mean, are we going to create a scenario where it does become less of a world representation?
This is where I actually like the idea, which at the moment the precedent's set for, that you do it different based on the regions. Like you assess, first of all, the bigger picture, like Europe, obviously. In Europe, all you essentially need is just let people play the games. You'll figure out who the best are, then invite the right teams. As he's saying, each other region has its own special idiosyncratic concerns. And so I would actually just prefer, like as you're saying, especially regions that aren't even the major ones, like Middle East obviously is irrelevant right now, right? In theory, if there was some awesome team there, again, I want like some sort of one big grand open qualifier or something. So maybe for that one, you do make like a slightly different thing. Maybe they just have to be within a certain region, then they get like a closed qualifier invite to another thing or something like that, or you can have some stipend program or something if you reach a certain... I wouldn't mind things like that. The key thing for me is just this. I don't mind if you had like help for other regions. I just don't want it to be that they directly qualify. What I didn't like about what changed in Valve's system was we used to have it before where we had like minors, which were sort of like an RMR. But then the key thing was they all led into that, what now is the beginning of the major, but it was just called the major qualifier back then. And the reason that was so genius is because that way, if you were from like a minor region that wasn't good, pick the ones that we all know everyone says, then it didn't matter because you didn't really cheat the system. You just went to that qualifier and you would just get destroyed and you'd get kicked out, and then someone like NIP or something would qualify instead of you. But I'll tell you what, if you were that team, like a Vegas squadron famously did this, who beat NIP to get in the major, then no one had a problem with it. So I think that logic will absolutely apply in this case. Like you can give some of these smaller regions, like if it's one that doesn't have its own space, like because obviously the main problem the Middle East going to have is they also don't have many tournaments, right? Not least because the tournaments they do have really are just the European tournament ESL runs. Like they're not really bringing in Middle Eastern teams to the tournament, are they? So if they don't have their own scene, I wouldn't mind them like being able to like have their own little qualifier that gives them a slot into like an RMR or something. Just crucially, don't let them go straight to the major. If you do that, I think everyone's fine with the idea that if you actually beat the teams to get there, then you can have the spot, you know.
Yeah,
I was trying to think about this though because of all the rumors about them doing away with the RMRs completely. Because for me, I was like, how does that work for the Middle East? How does that work? Because the Middle East normally gets in. My understanding is South Africa, the Gulf, Middle East, they all play their own qualifiers. Then they have a qualifier of like the top of them all together. Then they go to the Asian, I think it's the Asian qualifier before they even get to the RMR. But like, if you did away with all of that, then are we going to be in a situation where some random Middle Eastern team no one's ever heard of that's never played is going to suddenly have a take? And for me, it's about having a spot in the major, but that means taking it away from it. I hate to say a team that deserves to be there more, but to me, it does feel like the major should be a celebration of the best teams. Like I feel pretty strongly that that's what it should be. I mean, that could inevitably be, could that be the thing that happens? Yeah, surely not.
Yeah, I think Asia has to have an RMR. I don't think that's. I don't see there's any other world where Asia cannot have an RMR because again, it's similar to the North America South America thing. These teams just cannot play against each other.
Yes,
like not without physically flying somewhere. So like, there's no way you can determine who is a better team between a Middle Eastern team against an East Asian team against a Southeast Asian team against an Oceanic team.
Yes.
I mean, obviously, you can say Greyhound or FlyQuest should beat them all, but like I think you still have to see it. Because they don't play domestically. There's no way you can have a barometer of these teams because they don't play. So I think you could maybe in the future say Americas, if the ranking gets somewhat fixed, and obviously without the partner leagues and everything else, I think Americas, you could probably say it even without having an RMR, despite the fact they don't play against each other. But with Asia, I think there's no chance. I think you have to play an RMR because there's so many sub-regions that just contribute to that wider region. Alternatively, have two separate RMRs and split it somehow or something. But I think just one RMR makes a ton of sense.
We're also doing that thing you notice where like we're acting like these regions are like identical in sight. They're just a different one. But like it is absurd to imply like there's a region where like if you live at the north of China, you need to play the team at the bottom of Australia. It's like that would be like someone on the west coast of America playing like a Russian team. Like that not only cannot happen, like it's an absurd premise, isn't it? So how were you? Like we only call it like the Asia/Oceanic region because they were just so irrelevant. They had one little tournament. Like it can't really be considered a region. It isn't one. Like it's like 5 regions combined basically.
I do.
That with him, even Southeast Asia should probably have its own one if you think of it.
Well, I don't think people actually realize like how difficult it is. I know, so like South Africa, they have these little qualifiers, and then if the team that wins the qualifier can then play in the Middle East qualifier. But in order to do that, they then have to get on a plane and fly all the way to the Middle East because if they try to play from home, it's impossible. Yes. And it's like for most of these teams, I mean, just in the Middle East, I think if you play in like one country versus the other, you physically can't because the ping is so bad. So I think there's like a level of expense that goes into it, but none of that actually matters, because my point is that it should be the best teams, right? Which kind of leads me into the other
Sure.
change that's happened here, which is the regional slot distributions actually changed. So
Sure.
I'm going to read these numbers because I'll probably get them wrong, but
Come on.
all 8 elimination stage slots now go to Europe. And then for the opening stage...
By the way, technically, Graham's actually to blame for that, so, you know.
Yeah,
because it was based on
I mean,
last major, if people don't know. Yeah, exactly. So
yeah,
you can thank God for that.
Yeah, there we go.
Also made the last one, so we could have upped from 1 to 2, and then we went from
True.
1 to 0. So yeah, we can fix that for next time. That's a major by major thing, so we can fix that.
Sure.
So I mean, for now we're happy, right? It is a very major by major. Like the slots are fine. We've seen now with the opening stage. Obviously, Europe's got 6, Americas have 7, Asia has 3. Are we all happy with that? I mean, that's just a standard thing, right? It's based on performance. Carrying an entire region on your shoulders and failing them, Graham. I mean, you did that, so.
I'm personally responsible. The British guy is personally responsible for
sabotage. Exactly, you did it from inside. Exactly. Well done.
You did it for us. Again. You did it for us.
I'm gonna rip off my shirt and have the Smooya shirt underneath, and then start shouting Messi or something, and go from there. But I think the regional distribution is great. I think Asia getting 1 extra slot is deserved. I think they deserved 1 extra slot for how well the Mongols played, and it'll be nice to have more representation from them. But I do worry about the quality of the third team coming from the Asian RMR. It might just be a straight back down kind of situation, but it's the rules are set out and the Mongols earn the slot, so it'd be great to see a third team. America's got 2 extra slots this time compared to last time. This is the most slots we've had since post-COVID. Actually, I think even in PGL Stockholm we only had 6 slots. So America's is I guess thanks to Brazil mostly. Because we didn't earn the slot because we already had the slot from starting in the legend stage. So it was the Brazilian teams that got the extra slots back for the region. So, it's meritocracy at the end of the day. That's how Valve determined it. So I think it's fine. Europe having all 8 legend slots is fair because they earned them. So, we have to work to get them back.
Do you think they'll keep that system in place? I mean, moving forward, depending on what they change in terms of qualification for the major, do you think that those slots will still kind of be allocated depending on major performance, or is that going to need a sort of relook if they do away with the RMRs?
I don't see why they would change it. That actually brings an interesting point. There is one other change they made which we haven't mentioned, which is now they're inviting a lot more teams directly to the RMR. Because in the past, they would only invite the top 16 teams from the previous major. But now they're saying they're going to invite half of the teams to the RMR. So Asia will have 4 teams directly invited to their 8-team RMR. Europe will have 16 teams across 2 separate RMRs directly invited. And now Americas will have 8 teams directly invited to their RMR, whereas previously it would have been just the top 16 teams. So it would have been like 5, I think, this time. But in the past, it's only been 1 team. Like the previous major before that, it was only Fury that were invited directly to the RMR. So I think seeing that progression go onwards, I could see how they could keep the distribution the same as well. But I think, again, it's one of those things that's like it's a bit too early to know until we understand how their ranking is going to work and things like that. But I can't see why they would necessarily change that. I think the meritocracy system they have right now has been working to some degree. When the Americas region sucked, we lost a lot of slots, and now we're having a bit of a resurgence and we got the slots back, and Asia has a good team now, so they're getting a slot back. I think it's fine. No issues with that at all.
You mentioned that other change. I mean, how do you feel about that? The fact that now it doesn't matter it used to be you got invited based on the elimination stage of the major. Now it is completely based off those regional standings, close qualifiers. I mean, do we like that? Do we feel like that's not fair to the teams that did well in the major? I'm of the opinion that this is good. I think competition changes, and just because you did well at the last major, we've seen how quickly things change. But I wonder how that's been picked up. I mean, for you, Messioso, I mean, how does your team feel about it? How do you feel about that?
I mean, this was the first time we actually earned our slot directly to the RMR, so we technically now have something to lose, whereas before we had it guaranteed. So, in theory, it's a bad change for us, but, realistically, if we're not ranked in the top 8 teams in Americas, that's a huge fucking problem. So from my personal perspective, it shouldn't change much for us because we should never be in that position in the first place. But I mean, I think it's good because, you can look at a team like Liquid, for example, who didn't play the last major. They obviously suffered very similar scheduling issues to us. Furia, Pain, Mibbo, those kind of teams all suffer the same kind of scheduling issues we have, where we need to be in Europe more often to compete at the level that we want to compete at. So not having to go back and play a close qualifier right at the start of the season is just a benefit to us all. So I don't see any negatives to that at all. I think it's a huge positive to a lot of teams. It's going to benefit a lot of teams. So from my perspective, like, it should be good, and obviously it'll benefit some of the slightly smaller teams who might get to skip the qualifiers, which is just a nice little bonus. So yeah, I think it's a good change all around.
So, I mean, overall, from what I'm gathering, we're all pro the changes, despite the fact that the majority of the internet was up in arms about how horrible this was, which, again, why? Why
I'll give you another speculation, because one of the things that I noticed was drawing a lot of the sympathy was when those teams that are like the small orgs that are trying to do the sort of lottery entry to the RMR to get the millions from the stickers. When this happened, a bunch of them were like, "Oh, I guess we'll just have to shut the org now. We can't even run the team." And I'd just refer you to what I made that point at the beginning of the episode. It's like, mate, if your team can't actually compete actively in the professional Counter-Strike circuit and earn your way to this spot, then you were already doing some weird, like, min-max, cynical shit anyway. Because the problem with those orgs is, Sam, it might sound sad because it does mean money's going to go out of the scene. There's not going to be as much available. But a lot of those orgs, in the same way as they're now going to close because there's no chance. Well, if you ever went and saw, without mentioning certain names, some of them just dropped their teams anyway when they failed the RMR. So there was, I think already those orgs weren't necessarily in good faith competing in CS, I think some of them were just gambling that if I somehow, like, with the smallest salary ever and paying 2 months worth of salary, if this team with like this young CIS wunderkind qualifies me, then I'm in the money now. I've got my like 40% of all that sticker. Well, that just seems at that point like you're just gambling. Like, I don't really know that you're here to build CS up and make an awesome scene. So even though I certainly feel bad for players who might have a little bit less opportunity if some of those smaller orgs don't go out, I'm not really sure they were going to be in for the long haul and help those players out anyway. I feel like actually they almost were setting an impossible task anyway. I don't think most of those teams that shuttered and said they won't be in CS, they probably were never going to make it through the RMR, even if they got to the RMR. I actually think another reason as well, then, to tag on to that, is I actually think for real, everyone's brains are broken because of that Blast Paris Major. Because at the Blast Paris Major, the kind of teams who might not even make it through an RMR, like Into the Breach, Gamer Legion, Apex, they didn't just make it through. Gamer Legion could have fucking won the majors, the ridiculous thing. So unfortunately, it's almost making that Valve-esque thing of before, like, you should just let everyone play. What if someone's secretly dope? I think people almost buy into that. Whereas for me, I think that's the biggest outlier of all time, that one major. Not just even the teams making it, the idea they'd make the playoffs, that hasn't happened since, guys. Look at the playoffs of this last major. Where were all the random teams there? They weren't there. In fact, if you look at the history of the majors, usually the playoff stage is pretty ironclad. You have to be a top 12 or 10 team in the world. You just don't make it there. So it's another example where I think people are going to take outlier cases and think, but what about this person here? It's again, this is why you have to actually ask yourself stuff like, am I actually an egalitarian in esports? Do I want everyone to have an equal chance? I don't, Sam. I just only want the best teams. I don't give a fuck about the other team. So, but that's just me. I don't get to decide if that's definitely my position. As long as the good teams make it, I don't really care if the others don't.
I think that the Cinderella stories are pretty, but I'm with you, Thorin, because the Blast Paris Major is such a good example. Those small teams that you mentioned and how everyone got so excited. And I don't know if I'm just jaded in old age, but I was like, this isn't going to last. These teams are just going to get picked apart at the end of this. Everyone was, holy shit, the amount of people who were spending money on merch. And I was like, calm down. Just calm down. Because by the time your shirt arrives and they've shipped it to you, that team is gone. It's finished. And that was exactly what happened. So for me, there is a part of me
These are the most cynical takes of all time on the Blast Paris Major. She was watching it I wouldn't even bother ordering the breach to shit. They won't even be there in 2 months, lads. I love it.
You got your shit. But it was the truth. So the thing is, for me, some of these changes are phenomenally better, because at the end of the day, I do think that the major should be the celebration of the best teams. I think a Cinderella story is pretty, but I don't want that for the major. I think we'll now have an open circuit next year, so you can run your Cinderella story in every other event. And if it is such a good Cinderella story, then cool, because you'll be at the major. But it needs to be the best of the best, because I'm with Thorin. I want to watch the best teams battle it out. That's what the major's supposed to be, and it could lose. You don't want it to lose its glory. Let's be honest. No one was excited when we heard Gamer Legion was in the final. No disrespect to Gamer Legion. But it wasn't the...
No, everyone wanted heroic against Vitality, of course. Yes, of course. That
was all we wanted,
right?
So,
Apex crying in front of his home crowd, losing the major, I could maybe go for that. I love that. If you want to play the evil side of it, you could maybe go. That'd be funny.
That is quite evil, actually. But there we go.
By the way,
I'll
tell you a way we could even have a compromise, in my opinion, and both get what we want. I actually think also, like I alluded to there, I don't think the system we currently had, where you could in theory be randoms or semi-pros and make it still. Like I said, I actually think the orgs were quite cynical how they exploited that. I don't think they really then like made that its own thing. I think you'd be better off taking the money and the slots and the qualifiers and all that attention and time and logistics and money. If you actually really want to help make tournaments in small regions, then just give them their own tournaments. Or have like instead of a major, have like a minor where it's like all these other regions that aren't Europe and North America, and they all play each other and get experience and get like a regular routine, and then maybe the winner of that gets like a slot in the RMRs. Do that if you want, but that's the point as well, in my opinion. When you open it up, it might like by some like fucked up trickle down economics mean some teams get some more money and some slots, but I don't think you're actually gonna like insure it anyway. That's probably the silliest thing. Like, if I would argue this way, if the old system worked, wouldn't all these regions have been developed by now? Like, as far as I can tell, like we just talked about with the RMR slot, it's not really the case. Like, in fact, the joke is we can't even to this day assess how good regions are if they're not Europe, basically, because Europe just is the top team. So instead, what we end up doing is some weird proxy thing where we say, right, if Call or Liquid does really awesome, or Pain or Furia does really awesome, then we'll just sort of assume everyone in their region must be as good, and so give them an extra slot. Like, that sort of works, but it's a bit scoffed in itself. It's why actually one thing about the other Valve thing that I've always found a bit infuriating is they also have this weird thing, which I think is actually like a logical fallacy, where they sort of don't want to be the one that put the finger on the scale, but they don't realize that literally by choosing not to like filter something, by leaving it semi-random, you're making a choice. You're actually making a seeding choice by doing that. What you're saying is, I'm going to allow random elements to interfere with this. And the main issue is when you want to pick out teams for like an RMR or something, it's like with the seeding angle. You can't really just make seeding purely objective, because then, as we've just pointed out, there'll be a million loopholes. Like someone could, like then the Saudis, the joke is if they want Middle East to be awesome, they shouldn't buy teams. They should just make tournaments in the Middle East and invite all their teams. Like, there'll always be some loopholes. So at some point, a human does have to come into the equation and go, I will use my judgment and brain to know that is unfair, this is fair. You have to make the human judgment at some point. So in my opinion, that's why I said to me, it's not that all rankings are perfect, but as long as the people doing the ranking, I think, have good intentions and are competent, you'll eventually get to something that we can all agree is like reasonable to do, you know. So I hope Valve is also more open to that as well. Like, you should also, there's some degree of eye test / look at like the rest of the scene where you can sort of gauge how strong these regions are, but I don't think you can make a computer formula for it.
Messioso, anything to add? Anything that you wanted to jump on there?
Yeah, I mean, I could probably do a whole podcast on the Valve ranking at this point. I think I've been heavily involved in a lot of conversations around that, and there's definitely a lot of, the Valve ranking is not terrible for a lot of points it does, but there's definitely some small adjustments that need to happen, I think, moving into next year. But the way it's going to work for the majors, I think, is fine. I don't foresee any major issues, because again, like in Europe, the cutoff is so far down the ranking that like if you haven't managed to work your way into like comfortably into that cutoff, then you probably aren't really going to be making a long, deep run anyway. So you probably don't really matter in some ways. Like, it's good to have the lower end of that lower band of teams compete, because it's good experience, and you know they should have a shot. But like if you're a team that definitively says I should be in that qualifier, then you should be able to make top 30-ish in that ranking and be deserving of it. So I think going into the RMRs, I think it's fine, minus the caveat of the whole North America, South America thing. But yeah, I think I don't foresee any issues. I think it's going to be fine. I think the whole negativity about losing open qualifiers was quite overblown. If you ask me,
come on. Like, think how rarely any team actually lost those that was actually good. It was usually the teams that had dodgy lineups anyway that got beat by like a team that usually wasn't even bad. It was like a semi-pro European team. I've got a thing that will trigger you though. Here's one thing I want to ask you about the old system and the RMRs, which is what I can't believe that North Americans are really good at whining normally on the internet. Dude, the people in North America did not complain enough about these last few RMRs, where the RMR for the Americas was a Swiss system that wasn't even a full Swiss system, that was like botched, where people were doing stuff like, oh god, if you know how a Swiss system works, like, you know, half the teams go through and they don't, like, they were doing it where like you could have the same number of wins and not go through, and like you were doing like almost like flip a coin, or in your case like you play like 2 games or something. Like, that part was mental to me. That format was really crazy, mate.
Well, the really thing that was completely scuffed about the most recent RMRs was that because we didn't fully play out the full RMR because we got eliminated after 2 losses.
Yep.
The bookhold system that uses, if you played a team that got eliminated, you couldn't earn any more bookholds from them or lose any more bookholds from them. So you were essentially cut off at the knees at some point, and that's why we saw those some stupid matches. Not just because the initial seeding was wrong. Like Liquid are not the 15th seed in America.
Of course.
Like, that was just a clusterfuck. That should never have happened. But like the fact that halfway through the RMR, you just stopped gaining bookholds from the teams that were eliminated just meant that you would like it wasn't a fair tiebreaker at that point. Like they should have just done double elimination at that point. When it gets below 6 teams, double elimination. 6 teams is fine because it sorts out okay. Because then you still play the 3-2 matches. You still have the full Swiss played out.
Sure.
You know, you still have to tiebreak between the teams, but you still play the full Swiss. That's the main thing. But as soon as you get to 5 teams and you only take the 3-1 teams, just switch to double elim. Anything between 4 and 5 should just be double elim. And then if you do that, the seeding will be wrong if it's wrong, but I could have forgiven that. But the format for the last 2 America's RMRs were just terrible.
By the way, the example you gave there is a better one. I should have used that myself. The Liquid one's a great one because that shows what I mean about if Valve's going to treat it like, hey, I can't say if this team is better. Like, yes, true, Team Liquid wasn't a real team with that lineup before. They'd never played together. But nobody could look at a lineup with like Twists, Snarf, you know, you kind out and go, I don't know, maybe they are the 15th best team in it. Like, even without seeing them play, you all knew they were going to be like most of the teams in the RMR. I agree. That's an example where we've got to, like, there's doing things in theory, but practice has to matter too. Like, the actual output has to matter too, guys.
Yeah. I asked Valve about it, and they said they didn't want to reseed because most of their matches were from Blast Premier, the partner league. So they didn't want to reseed the ranking between the closed qualifier and the RMR because of the impact of mostly Blast, but also I think IEM Katowice might have been between there as well. But I made the point that they could have just taken the open qualifiers and the closed qualifier results that Liquid played, and they would have still earned enough to not be ranked. I mean, I think technically they were 16, but because that team dropped out because they were cheating, they moved up to 15. And then Energy got put in at 16, despite being ranked higher than Liquid in the world ranking, you know, whatever. So, yeah, if they'd done that, it wouldn't have been any problem. It also would have fixed Falcons in Europe as well. They were super low seeded in theirs. So both of them would have been aided by the fact that they would have had some of those matches added. So yeah, I mean, I think they could have fixed it, but I understand why they maybe didn't want to fix it. So yeah, I'm sort of on the fence about that. But there was definitely an opportunity to get it done. And again, you know, in the future, Liquid again won't just form as a team, 2 weeks before the RMR. So it shouldn't be a problem in the future because to get to the RMR, you have to have played a few matches. So that's a problem that is now gone at least. So hopefully that won't happen again.
So here's my curveball question to wrap this all up. I already know that the answer to this is yes, because we all know that the RMRs at the moment are more prestigious than the major. Should it be that way? And if not, how the hell do we change that moving forward other than doing away with the RMRs?
Well, the good thing is, apparently they are going to do with them anyway. But even if we kept it, the reason why I actually think this system that's coming up also has an incentive to the scene that will be very valuable is because I'm actually pretty sure if you think of all the top orgs, this is just going to immediately set it to be a bit like League of Legends messioso. Like everyone will just do their roster moves after the major. Or if you don't qualify for the major, you'll make your roster moves. It'll make it almost like there'll be 2 off seasons, like League has its 1 off season at the end of the year after Worlds, obviously. And people will be able to also structure contracts and things. I think it'll actually streamline the scene a little bit because, as you say, you won't have what we have now, which is actually caused the RMR. It's like the RMR all bust basically now to qualify to the major because of the stickers. So actually, it's the other way around. You'll get teams who actually might cynically just cut their team a month before the RMR and then scramble and get free agents like the aforementioned Smooyers, etc. As lottery tickets and just go, hey, if I make it, I make it. Whereas now I think you're actually incentivized to make a real lineup. No, it has to be for the long term. Compete in the circuit, earn your points through actually other tournaments, which is what we all want to watch anyway, and then you'll be at the tournament. So I think that aspect is very positive. I do think the only thing is like when the only issue is this. In a way, the one thing I do like about the RMR is it means it's not just purely the circuit. Like, it's not just like if you come second in the circuit, you should automatically be at the major. It probably still should play some sort of a match. You should still prove the form in a way, you know. So I don't mind a compromise between the two. By the way, I just think the old system was really bad. So almost any change I was going to be in favour of. I'm quite biased in that sense.
Yeah. Would you be in favor of, like, for example, the Legends teams going directly to the major based on the circuit rankings and then the other teams going for the RMRs?
The problem I have is this.
I'm a huge fan of that.
When they used to have it back, this is again where I'm always actually, there's two ways we can do it. We can either do it like really old school and be pure principles, or we can do it more like, I think you should have a compromise based on what will practically happen. So the old system where like top 8 used to make you automatically get to the next major, that only worked because there just weren't that many good teams. So it just actually ensured all the good teams got to go to the next major. So at the time that seemed good. That actually would be terrible now. Like if I've just dissed Blast Paris Major, I wouldn't want those 8 teams. I wouldn't want Into the Breach to automatically be at the next major a year later because they were at that one. So I would say it's more like, I actually do, even though you might like it, I still think like the reason why I actually like the idea of the circuit itself is determinant is I do actually think that is better than whatever the last major is, because the space between the majors is going to be big enough now. I do feel like you could get some really dodgy snap. Like the most obvious one, I'll give you, I think probably the best example you could get right now is imagine after PGL Copenhagen that Monacy really did leave G2. And then they get someone, but it's not Monacy or Shiro or something like insane. Or they just get whatever Orpa. Let's just pick anyone. Pick Zalti or something. He was a pretty good player still. G2 would be so much worse. I wouldn't want them automatically at the major because they were top 4, if you know what I mean. Like that, or automatically in the RMR. Like I think they still should have to prove it in the circuit, as it were.
Yeah, I think everyone has to go through the circuit. I mean, the reason why inviting the old, like the top 8 teams used to work was because we used to have 3 majors a year. I think that's a forgotten
that's true as
point,
well. Yes.
Is that the gap between majors was only like 3 months in some cases. And like most teams are pretty consistent enough that like they're still, you could argue that maybe like, oh, you could switch these 2 teams around and it would be fair. But like, yeah, I think back then it made a lot more sense. But as soon as we started getting like 6, 7, sometimes 8 months between these majors, it was like, this doesn't make any sense anymore. Like teams can really wildly fluctuate, transfer can happen, all these things. You were allowed to make two changes to your roster. Like if your roster got picked apart, if you were, an Apex or a Gamer Legion, for example, last time, some of the players they lost, key players they lost, completely changed the outcomes of their teams. So like you can't do that with that. But yeah, in the past it wasn't quite as bad. So I think that was something that a lot of people forget about the old system was the cadence of the majors was much more routine, much more regular. So I think we're in a pretty good place now. I think that you could maybe make a call that the defending champion could get an automatic slot. I don't
mind that one.
Yeah, I don't mind.
I'll tell you the angle people. Yeah, I'll tell you the angle people miss on that one, Messi. So it's not that means the defending champion themselves are guaranteed to be good. It's more just that like it's a good narrative that someone beats them at the next major, no matter even if they're the worst team. I think that I agree with you. That one lone outlier probably is good just for the narrative, right? It's kind of wacky because the other thing I've always thought is really hard to explain to a casual fan who only watches the majors is how do you start the next major if the actual winner hadn't? Luckily, it never happens. But imagine like for example, that like Na'Vi didn't qualify. How would you start the tournament and then mention to a casual fan, by the way, here's why Na'Vi isn't even at this tournament? Like, never mind that they've lost already; they aren't even here. Like, it would be so hard to like sort of break that down in 1 minute. I feel like.
Yeah, so I'd be a fan of that. I don't know how you'd fix that on the slot distribution. That might be an interesting topic, but I could make a case for that just purely out of storyline, and also I think there's a certain level of prestige that to say that you shouldn't fall that far from grace. But yeah, other than that, I think earning your way through the circuit is a reasonable way to qualify some teams to the major, but it shouldn't be the only way. I think especially with Asian RMR cannot disappear. If that disappears, I think we're in real trouble with the Asian region. I could get on board with it for Europe and North and Americas if the ranking is very, very good, but it's still like a single snapshot 1 point of the year. If you just had like a few bad events leading up to it, you can just I still think the RMRs are very valuable to the ecosystem. I'd be sad to see them go away, and I think that they should have space made for them in the calendar. Personally, at least for the next year, would be my personal preference. But if they have to go away, then so be it. But we'll adapt and we'll discover how things work, and I'm sure Valve will make changes eventually anyway. Like they've sometimes we say they're too slow, sometimes we say, whoa, what the hell are you doing? That came out of nowhere. So it's I think the one thing we'd all wish is that we had more communication and a better understanding, and maybe more of a foresight into what their plans are. Like I said, Cloud9 would have probably loved to have known that their roster should have been built 2 months ago so that they could qualify this major. That sucks, and they're going to suffer for that. But ultimately, Valve could have just implemented this change for the next major of next year, and everything would have been fine. So I think just better communication is the main thing we need, and just a better foresight of what's coming up and what changes to be expected. Like, there's no reason just to drop a bombshell every 6 months on changing things. That's my personal opinion.
By the way, I've got one more reason for you. One more speculation.
I'm ready.
For why
I'm ready.
people are so heated about this. And it's a really cynical take from me. And it's even rude because I'm actually now going to make slightly rude to someone who was a guest on this show. If you know it's bad if I do this preamble. I love Sponge. Even as I say that, it sounds bad. It's actually not even going to be that bad. Basically, the premise is, spoiler, I don't know if this is called considered a crazy conspiracy theory, but Sponge might have a little bit of bias towards, let's say, like FlyQuest / Australian Counter-Strike. So I think, understandably, he doesn't want RMRs to go away. By the way, I agree with him. I think Messioso's right. Those particular regions probably should have RMRs, but understandably, the region that he climbed out of, the fucking Bane pit that he climbed out of, / his boys in FlyQuest, like if we get rid of that system, it's going to be a lot harder for them to make it to these majors. I mean, at the moment, they're actually one of the big benefactors of the RMR system. They're almost guaranteed, along with potentially the Mongols of the world, to just make it whether they're good or not, actually. So I think that's a valid reason. It's just, as usual, I think people have looked like the sentimental stories. People have gotten a bit carried away with them, where sometimes you have to just look at the cold, hard reality.
Here we go. Sometimes I am actually soft and squishy. Today I'm with Thorin.
Okay.
Damn it. I think it should just be the top teams in the ranking and screw everyone else. Like best of the best,
exactly.
play tough. Like you don't have money, you don't have an org, tough. You can't join us now. I mean, I think we found a nice middle ground, but it's up to you now. Tell us what you think in the comments. I'm sure you'll tell us that the open qualifiers should come back. We'll hear from you. You can let us know. Thank you so much for watching. Thanks, gents, and we'll be back soon.